Well, welcome. Thank you for coming. Thank you to any in the audience out there online who happen to be watching this. It is my pleasure to introduce Sarah Ralston, who is our first speaker for this year's Colloquium. Sarah earned her master's in library and information studies from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and she's been teaching information literacy at EOU since 2010. As an instruction librarian, Sarah works with topics such as media literacy, scholarly communication, and critical evaluation, as well as information search skills. Her current interests include information literacy in the disciplines and intersections between AI literacy and information literacy. During her sabbatical, Sarah spent several months traveling in France, Poland, and Germany, reconnecting with her roots, as well as exploring ways to scaffold library instruction to more efficiently integrate with requirements of EOU majors. She will share some of the results of that work with us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you everybody for coming. Like all librarians, I love public speaking. So it's really nice to see so many supportive faces. I have been going around and around about what I wanted to talk about in this presentation because I did pack quite a lot of things into this last year. And so while I'm primarily going to be speaking about this major project that I completed for the library, that wasn't necessarily the most interesting thing to me. So before I get into that project, I do want to talk first for about 10 minutes or so about my time in Germany, what that was all about, why that was important to me beyond the professional connections that I made. So on this title slide here, this image is a picture of my favorite German food, Maultaschen, which is something that my Oma used to make for me. And it's having a little bit of a moment right now. So I wanted to try and think of a way that I could embed this throughout my presentation. Maybe make it a metaphor for something else that I'm going to be talking about. But the reality is I just want to talk about it. I want to eat it. I want to think about it. I kind of want the world to know about it. So I'm here to evangelize for like 2 minutes about Maultaschen. So bear with me with my Maultaschen montage here. Maultaschen is sort of like a ravioli. So it's ground up meat, usually pork, sometimes pork and beef mixed together. With spinach and parsley and onions, and then it's wrapped into a noodle and dropped in boiling water, chopped up into little squares. It's usually served with broth, but it might also be served, as you see in the pictures on the outer edges here, with a little side of potato salad and some sauce. It used to be, when I was growing up, that you could only find this in Swabia. It's a Swabian delicacy, so this region of southern Germany where my family comes from. And it was something that was always homemade. So you could maybe find it in a traditional Swabian restaurant, but you really couldn't find it in other parts of the country. You certainly could not find it in the US. But now that it's experiencing this renaissance, you can see this is the Maultaschen section of the grocery store, of the refrigerated section. It comes in all of these different flavors and varieties and different kinds of meats, which has been revolutionary for me because really at a time during the pandemic thinking about this and how I could get it into my belly. The word Maultaschen is one of these beautiful German compound nouns. So the word Maul is sort of a Swabian dialect word for the mouth of an animal. And then Taschen means bags or sacks if you're from Oregon. So it means mouth bags. But it's so much more delicious than it sounds. That's really all I have to say about food. I could give an hour-long presentation about Southern German cuisine, and if you want to hear that presentation, just call me. And I can advise you on what you should eat. But I wanted to use this as sort of an entry point to talk a little bit about my family story and how that has come full circle in a weird way here at EOU. So this photo right here, this is my mom, VC, and her mom, my Oma. This was taken in 1996, which was the year that my mom went on her sabbatical when she was about the same age as I am now. She was born in Ditzingen, which is in the state of Baden-Württemberg. This is a close-up of the region of Baden-Württemberg in southern Germany. And Ditzingen is represented by that green pin. So I grew up traveling there about every 2 years until I was in my 20s when my grandmother ended up moving to the north. So they lived in Ditzingen and they lived in Backnang, which is where the purple pin is. So this was a region that had a whole lot of meaning for me. My mom immigrated to the US when she was 19 on a student visa after she met my dad, who was a foreign exchange student from California who was studying abroad in Germany. So there's a theme of study abroad and foreign exchange that has kind of run throughout my family for generations. I did study abroad, my sister did study abroad, many of my uncles and aunts did study abroad. My grandparents hosted foreign exchange students kind of on an endless parade all through the years that my dad and his siblings were in high school. So it's something that's always been really, really important to me as well. After my grandmother moved to the north of Germany when I was in my 20s, we pretty much stopped going back to this region. We would just go visit her where she lived in the north. And during the pandemic, I found myself feeling really nostalgic about the south of Germany. It's culturally different than the north of Germany, and the food is so much better than in the north of Germany. So I was really looking for excuses to get back to this area, and I kind of made this commitment to myself after, recreating a bunch of recipes and things during the pandemic, that I would go back when travel restrictions eased up and spend a more substantial period of time. This is where Baden-Württemberg is on the larger German map. So it's in the southwest corner. It's right next door to Bavaria. Bavaria is where the Lederhosen comes from. It's where Oktoberfest is. It's where all the German stereotypes that you know come from. Not the same culture at all as Baden-Württemberg. And this quote, this was the slogan for the Baden-Württemberg Tourist Bureau for a good decade or so. Wir können alles außer Hochdeutsch, which means we can do anything except speak High German. Which is funny because Swabian German is quirky and it is much maligned by speakers of High German, but it has some gems for sure. So going back to the Multaschen montage, this phrase right underneath, Herrgott bescheißerle, this is like a very colloquial dialect term for Multaschen that essentially translates to tricking the Almighty. And the idea is that on Fridays you're not supposed to eat meat, but by hiding it in a noodle, God won't see it, and you can get away with it. I learned this phrase at a restaurant this past year, and I just was so charmed by it because that kind of like Swabian pranksterism, this mischievousness that is very characteristic of these two people right here, was just so charming to me. And it just made me really think a lot about, the stereotypes that we have about Germany and German culture and German people and how a lot of those are wrong. There's a certain playfulness and mischievousness that I think people don't know about. Okay, so this is obviously a place that means a lot to me. It has a lot of things that I love, really good food, quirky language, but it also has a connection to EOU that a lot of people don't really know about. The Oregon Baden-Württemberg Exchange Program is a cultural and student exchange program where students from the Oregon State Universities and Willamette University can exchange fairly easily, can go abroad to any of the partner institutions in Germany, in this particular region of Germany. It's been around since 1968. I learned about the program from our provost, Dr. Geisinger, who came here as a university student on this exchange program when he was a college student in Germany. So he's always been really interested in this program and kind of reviving it. Before 2020, we always had a couple of German students from this part of the country visiting us here for a year at EOU, and we would send students in turn. My colleague, Kim Olsen-Charles, her daughter is on this exchange program right now in Stuttgart. And so it's something that has died back a little bit for Eastern, but I know that the program coordinators are interested in re-engaging with us, and I would love to see more of that happen. So as soon as I learned that there was this connection between Oregon and Baden-Württemberg, I wanted to be a part of that. So when I was scouting around for ideas for my sabbatical that would take me to Germany, Peter shared with me a lot of information and connected me with some contacts at the regional offices and the program offices for this program, both in Baden-Württemberg and at OSU. And they in turn connected me with library staff and library directors at some of their partner institutions, who I was then able to interview about things like library culture, workplace culture, approaches to information literacy instruction in Germany, German degree hierarchies in libraries, which is really different than it is here. So on the left, these are some of the people that I spoke with in Baden-Württemberg at the University of Tübingen, the University of Heidelberg, and the Pädagogische Hochschule Ludwigsburg, heretofore referred to as PH Ludwigsburg, because that's easier to say. And then I also had an opportunity to attend the European Conference on Information Literacy in Krakow, Poland, where I met Dr. Franke from the University of Bamberg, which is not in Baden-Württemberg, it's in Bavaria. And I spent a day at the Alfred Wegener Institute for Polar Research, where I have a friend who's a researcher, and he introduced me to the archivist there, Dr. Selewski, and he then introduced me to the library director, and both of those men were incredibly generous with their time. They set up a whole day for me where I was able to tour the archive. We talked about German archives law, European Union archives law, the landscape for open science in the European Union, and open access publishing, as well as all of those other things like information literacy and workplace culture and all of those things. So that was really a highlight of the trip, was to be able to spend that time there. So I already shared a lot about what I learned about libraries with my colleagues in the library. I don't think a lot of it is that interesting to anybody else. So I'm going to transition into the other part of the talk here in a second, but I had also really hoped to try and find some research connections or maybe teaching opportunities, and it just did not prove fruitful for me for a variety of reasons, but there are just certain structural barriers to being able to teach over there that I was not able to overcome. So I shifted to the other project. But there are a couple of things that I wanted to highlight for anybody who might be interested, because I would love to see more activity happening with this program. And even though I was not necessarily able to participate in these, some of you might be able to. The Ludwigsburg International Classrooms program. This is a program where faculty from the Oregon institutions can go to PH Ludwigsburg and teach a mini course for anywhere from a week to 4 weeks in English. You stipend, and then you also have free room and board while you're there, and they facilitate all of the connections for you. It's way more accessible than you might think, so a lot of times it can be scheduled outside of when your normal EOU teaching would happen. We have had faculty participate in this program a long time ago, but it's been a while, especially because of COVID. But this is a great program. It wasn't a good fit for me because they have to have an exact match for the credits to align, and so my subject, information literacy, there just wasn't a match. But if you teach in a more traditional discipline, there's probably a chance that you could apply to this program and teach over there. And I recommend that you do, and do some good eating while you're at it. The other program is the Baden-Württemberg Faculty Mobility Grant, and this is from last year. There isn't a website for it, but this was sent to Peter, who shared it with me. And when I spoke to the program coordinators, they said they would be doing it again this year. So presumably, Peter is going to be the point of contact again for this. This is just funding to travel to facilitate research collaborations or your own research interests. So it kind of covers airfare. I think they just give you like I can't remember what the dollar amount was, $2,000 or something like that. It covers a fair amount of the travel expenses. And then there are people on the ground in their program offices will help facilitate networking and connections, which is what they did for me. They were able to do some advanced research to figure out which were the libraries that were the best fit for me to speak with, and then introduce me to those people. So I can vouch for how great those folks are. So if you want to talk about this at any point in time or get some food recommendations, hit me up for that. If you want to be invited to my Multashen party, there's a sign-up sheet. Just kidding. Just let me know. On to the fun part. Information literacy across the EOU curriculum. So this project, as I said, I shifted to this, but I already had this in mind. I've had this in mind for a long time. We started doing some advanced work around this topic several years ago, and it was something that I always wanted to come back to. And it was something that it just was such a gift to have the time over the past year and the space to really focus on this without my other responsibilities kind of getting in the way. Before I talk about what I actually did, I want to give a little bit of background about library instruction at EOU to kind of set the landscape. We have a long tradition of teaching credit-bearing library courses at EOU. So when I was first hired in 2010, I taught 2 sections of the 3-credit course, Information Literacy, Library 127, every term, and it had a course cap of 33 students, and it was always full. We had at that time 4 teaching librarians who were teaching credit courses, and we averaged for a good, 5 or 6 year period, around 20 sections, both on campus and online, of library courses that enrolled over 200 students a year. So this was kind of our main hallmark for a long time. And as things started to shift, so as we followed changes in the field, as we assessed, as we did our own self-reflection, and as our numbers were reduced, we started thinking about how can we do more? How can we reach more students in more relevant ways than by teaching credit courses? There's this whole thing about library credit courses just not being in context, and it's not always the right way to approach things. So we've done things in order to address some of the deficits that we have seen, like embed in the first year experience or work with first year writing. We know that when students come as first year students to EOU, they're not performing as expected, as we would expect them to perform at the grade level that they're coming from. If you want to know more about that, if you're not familiar with that, you can talk to any of the library faculty about that, or check out my 2017 Colloquium, which looked at comparing the incoming information literacy skills and abilities of new freshmen with the 12th grade learning standards from the Oregon School Library Association. And just kind of ballpark, this was like a 4-year study, but just kind of ballpark, most of the students coming in were performing at about like a 6th or a 7th grade level. There aren't librarians in the schools. There aren't really like functioning libraries in most of Oregon. So a lot of the students that are coming to us from Oregon and from our region in particular are just not quite up to speed. So we're always trying to figure out, how do we lift that up? How do we bring them up to speed? And how do we do that more efficiently? Because teaching credit courses wasn't necessarily the most efficient way. Course integrated instruction is the type of scenario where you invite one of us to come into your class and we collaborate together for some information literacy instruction around an assignment. That's really where we think we can do our best work, at the point of need and in the context of the discipline. And so this is something that we have always been trying to drive and do more of. But we have to work to get those invitations. And that can sometimes be a lot of work, trying to set that up. So this project was meant to try and make things a little bit easier and find ways to make that process a little bit more efficient. So my guiding questions going into this were, how integrated is library instruction or information literacy instruction in each major? And which information literacy concepts are addressed across the curriculum, and where are the gaps? Because I think we have a sense of this as librarians, but it's a sense. We don't always know. The goals of the project were to ultimately identify the most appropriate courses for library research or information literacy instruction in each major in order to better scaffold integrated information literacy instruction across each major more intentionally and more efficiently. To do this, I started out by mapping out the curriculum. So I systematically looked at every major, every concentration, every pathway, I use the current program check sheets that are on the website in order to figure out what are the required classes that students have to take in each major or concentration or pathway, and the nearly required classes, so situations where students have to take like one of two options. If they have a choice of 1 and 15 options, that's an elective. That doesn't really serve my needs, because I'm looking for how can I capture any given student in any given major and make sure that they're receiving the instruction that they need as they go throughout their academic career. I sometimes had to fall back to the EPCC archive because it's a moving target. Things are changing all the time. And the EPCC archive is an excellent resource. Thanks, I think, in huge part to Angie Adams for maintaining that. By looking at that, I was able to see changes as they were occurring over the course of the year. So for example, I started this in January and I finished in June. And even during that time, there were a lot of changes, like sustainable communities was suspended. Communication studies changed to communications and media studies. The ag entrepreneurship degree is still sort of under development, so a lot of the requirements changed in that class. So, you know, this is really kind of like a snapshot of what's been happening, but I did have these resources to try and keep up to date as much as possible. Then for each major, so I put all of this on a spreadsheet. So there's a spreadsheet for every college, and then there's a sheet or a tab for every major, concentration, and pathway. And then I put all of the required courses on there, and then I went into the syllabi. So I used the college's master syllabi page, which is on the website, and then the Syllabus archive Google Drive. And then in some cases where I couldn't find the information I needed, I just reached out and I talked to individual faculty when I could. So for each required course, I captured whether or not it had UWR, what the course learning outcomes were, whether there were course learning outcomes that are related to information literacy, whether there is a library research or information literacy assignment, and then what would be the research skills and understandings that a student would need to have in order to be successful in that class. So I had a huge long list, but those are just a few examples. So being able to identify and read a scholarly article, understanding peer review, critically evaluating information sources, etc. One of the major limitations is that the syllabi on the college's master syllabus page are out of date. And no judgment about that. The people who need to know are aware of the problem. It's really a staffing issue. You know, the people who are responsible for doing this are often the program assistants in the colleges, and almost every college is down a full person right now. So they just have not had the capacity, but it's an accreditation requirement. So it will be updated at some point. It's just that when I was looking at them, they were fairly out of date. The Syllabus archive, the Google Drive, is up to date for the College of Science, Technology, Math, and Health Sciences. And that's fantastic because every term, faculty in that college turn in their syllabi to MJ, Heather, who then posts it in that syllabus archive. And then I can go in there and I can see the current assignments, the current instructor, the current course outline. It's just a wealth of information that helps me really zero in more on whether or not there's actual library research happening in those classes. It's not up to date for the other colleges, but that was still quite a lot. As I said, it was only a snapshot of what was current in the last year. So looking ahead at the EPCC agenda for next week, I can already see that there are changes that are going to be needing to be made based on things that are going to be coming through this year. And then everybody's time is really a barrier. So while I recognize that a master syllabus isn't necessarily going to contain every assignment, or even in some cases major assignments, or if it's out of date, maybe the instructor has changed and they've completely changed the assignments, this is at least a starting point where then I can have those conversations and my colleagues can have those conversations with program faculty later. I wanted this first stage to be as passive as possible so that I wasn't begging on anybody else's time while I was working through this, and then we'll start begging on your time as we go through this year. So the second part, once I had all of that information, was gathering together the courses that were the most relevant for information literacy and library instruction. So I looked at courses that had UWR, that had information literacy outcomes baked in, and that had library research assignments. And then I organized all of those together by major or concentration or pathway so that I could get a better picture of what might be potential target courses for library instruction. And then I coded the research skills and understandings that students would need to achieve success from my big long list into these 4 broader outcome areas. So identifying and interpreting appropriate information sources, critically evaluating information sources, searching for, selecting, and accessing information sources, and then using and citing sources in a research paper or another type of academic assignment. From there, it became pretty transparent or pretty obvious to me which courses could be identified in the lower division and the upper division as potential target courses. It's not always relevant in every major, and it's not always relevant to have it in both the lower division and the upper division. There's some programs where they don't really get into library research until the upper division, and so we don't necessarily need to worry about what's happening in the lower division. And then I made recommendations for library intervention. The major limitation to that process is that it was just done by me. So my perspective might be subjective. When I'm looking at course outcomes and trying to decide whether or not they're relevant to information literacy, I'm fairly confident. I've been teaching and studying information literacy for 14 years. I'm fairly confident that I got it right, but I do recognize that somebody else might look at it and just think of things a little bit differently than I do. This happens all the time when we sit down and try to break down concepts and things. We sometimes have slightly different interpretations. My recommended interventions are also subjective. And again, this was just meant to be a starting point that each of us as liaisons can then take out and have conversations with discipline faculty. I was really focused only on the types of activities that would benefit from our involvement as librarians or have students using library resources. So information literacy is much broader than just the library. And I know that there's conceptual information literacy instruction happening across the curriculum in all different kinds of ways that I don't always see, and that might not be reflected in the syllabus. So I'm specifically looking for activities and assignments where they're going to need to use library resources to find sources, for example. If you spend time with your students picking apart a primary research article and talking about how that article fits within the greater conversation around that topic, that's information literacy instruction. So that's the kind of thing that I don't need to be involved in. Librarians don't need to be involved in that. We will if you want us to, obviously, but we feel confident that you're perfectly capable of having those conversations with your students. Okay, so what were the end products? There are a few things that were really interesting to me. One of the things that kind of surprised me, considering how long I have been working here, is just the diversity of types of majors that we have here and how confusing that is from an outside perspective. And I think it might even be confusing for some of you that really just work in your own particular field. So we've got standalone majors, then we have some majors that have concentrations, and then we have a couple that have pathways, which are different from concentrations. And then we have majors that borrow from other disciplines or aggregate from other disciplines, like the information technology management degree, for example. There's classes in business and there's classes in computer science that students take for that. So this is great. I like the variety, but it makes things really challenging or really complicated if you are trying to look at any given student and whether they are able to meet university outcomes. So if you think of things like the UWR or the DPD requirement, or just our university outcomes on the whole, and information literacy is not one of our university outcomes. I think that it probably should be, but it isn't currently. But if you're trying to look at a high-level outcome like that and figure out how's a student going to get that, any given student traveling through any one of these pathways, how are they going to get that? It's challenging and it's messy when we have this type of variety. So that was something that was useful for me and then something I could take back to my colleagues as well to talk about. The next thing was that I created these guides, and these are really internal guides for the library liaisons in order to be able to have conversations with you all. And this is just one example. I used biology for a few reasons. One, it's fairly straightforward. It's just 2 target classes that I recommend in biology. 2, I was their liaison for a long time, so I know the program really well. And 3, I have allies in that program, so they're not going to get mad at me if I share their stuff. Brian Myers, my ally. So I'll just talk you through the example of biology, but recognize I have this for every major. So there's 2 concentrations. Sorry? So there's 2 concentrations, ecological biology and then molecular biology and pre-professional health. Students take the Principles of Biology class. This is the first biology class that majors are going to take as first-year students. It's a year-long sequence, so there's 211, 212, 213. Each one is accompanied by a lab. And in the winter term, the Biology 212 lab is where students are first assigned something where they have to find outside sources. So they have to find primary research articles to support an experiment that they're doing in the lab. So it's their first introduction to the concept of primary research articles. Like they may have talked about that in class before, but it's the first time they actually have to go out and find them. There's no information literacy learning outcome for the class, but there is that assignment and there are certain skills that they need to have to be successful in that. So I chose that as the target lower division for biology and also for biochemistry, because biochemistry pathway, those students take this class as well. And my recommendation is pretty basic. I have been in that class for many, many years. Now there's a new liaison, so it's just reestablishing that relationship with the new liaison. In the upper division is the general ecology lab. So this is a class that all students have to take in the major. It's a UWR. It does have several information literacy learning outcomes. This is the class where they really learn how to systematically write a research paper for biology in the style of a particular journal, a particular scientific journal. In this case, it's the journal Ecology. This is Laura Mart's class that she teaches. So this one is much more in depth. So it's the same types of skills, but scaled up to a higher level. So they get a library visit, and then we go a little bit deeper into some of those concepts and a little bit deeper into biology-specific library databases. After this point, students still have to write papers. They still have to find sources. They're still doing information literacy, but they don't need me for that. The instructors are kind of covering that. So that's why we've just identified these 2 specific courses in that major as our targets. Okay, the last thing, and this isn't really related to information literacy, this is more for the other side of the library liaison coin. So we have 2 roles as liaisons. One is teaching and the other is collection development. For collection development, that means that we are buying books and journals and making decisions about journals and databases and subscriptions for the disciplines that we're responsible for. If we were at a bigger school, like if we were at an R1 institution, we might have a master's degree in that subject area in addition to the librarian master's degree. But that's not very common at small schools, and it's definitely not common at a school as small as we are. So we don't necessarily have any real expertise in those subject matters. If we do, it's kind of coincidence. You know, I always tell people I did the sciences for a long time, but my undergraduate degree is in French. So I'm sometimes at a bit of a loss trying to understand what exactly I need to purchase in these areas that are not really familiar to me. So while I was already kind of rooting around in the curriculum, I took the opportunity to create these subject lists to just kind of help us and streamline our processes a little bit to try and figure out, okay, I need to make some purchases for economics. Let's make sure that I'm actually buying things that are at the scale of what we're teaching at EOU and that are subject specific in a way that's going to be relevant for our students and our faculty. So this was just kind of a bonus project that came out of it. Okay, next steps. This is the point where we're going to want to come and talk to faculty in the disciplines. As I said, this is really just capturing one person's perspective over the course of 1 year, and changes are happening all the time. I'm sure there are mistakes. I've already had several meetings with people where they said, that's not the right class. This is a better class to embed information literacy instruction. So I fully expect that to happen. Again, I was working with the information that I had, but I think those collaborations, those productive conversations will lead to better partnerships and better outcomes for students as well, if we can make sure that we're situated more relevantly. There's going to be revisions. We're not going to be able to reach every target audience. You know, this is really just a starting point to think about how we can be the most effective in what we're doing. So we're not going to limit ourselves to the target courses as well. If you want us to come and do a session for something that's not on the list, of course, we would be happy to do that. I think that the more opportunities that students get to have to engage with information, especially information sources that they've not been introduced to in the past, the better the outcomes will be. And we're always really interested in doing that in creative ways and more scaffolded ways than what we may have done in the past. So this, at a very base minimum, this gives us somewhere to start and figure out where to focus our attention and focus our hustle. I must have left something out because I timed it at 40 minutes. Any questions? Thank you.
Are there any questions about information literacy or German cuisine? Nancy.
Have you been working with Ilago on some of this stuff?
No. Ilago is the Information Literacy Advisory Group of Oregon, and so it's sort of a coalition of academic librarians who are teaching librarians across the state, and they have not really rebounded from the pandemic, so there has been less partnership as a result of that. But you know, it's as things kind of unfold, they're kind of my go-to group for bouncing ideas off of and getting ideas from. So yeah, I would expect I would talk to those people at some point.
Nicole?
I'm just curious if, so I did a first year experience course last year, and there must be research out there on this. What's the, how advantageous is it to have information literacy embedded in a specific discipline as opposed to sitting outside of it? Because in my very limited experience, and I hadn't taught it before, but getting them to go practice these skills without a grounding in a specific field or a project, it seemed, you know, I think the utility of it was not clear to them. It was sort of checking boxes. So my intuition is that maybe linking it to disciplines is good, but does this have any, like, will this inform the way we think of first year experience here?
I think it should. I really think it should. I mean, it's one of the reasons why we took that substantial information literacy component out of the first year experience that used to be there, for that exact reason. Like they're learning how to practice these skills, but they're not applying them in context. And then in a lot of cases, they're not actually being asked to apply them or practice them in their disciplines until they're juniors and seniors. And by then they've forgotten what we ever did in their first year experience class. So I spoke with student government, I surveyed students about what they thought about that. And they all kind of agreed, like, yeah, now that I'm a senior, I feel like I really could use this stuff, but they didn't remember anything that we had done in the uni classes. So, I mean, I feel very strongly that it's going to be much more effective in a disciplinary context because that's where you have those opportunities to apply it. Plus, the disciplines are so different. You know, just having a conversation with first-year students about what is a primary source, you know, in science, it's completely different than it is in history. And so trying to have that conversation with the students who don't even really know what their major is yet and then expecting them to remember that later on down the road, I think it's a waste of time. So I do think it should inform how we approach library instruction in the first year experience. And I think our library instruction should be more focused around the services that we offer, comfort using the library, breaking down barriers about asking for help in the library, those kinds of things, rather than that real focused information literacy instruction that we were doing. Yes. For the people at home.
You know what a fan I am of information literacy embedded in my classroom, so
I do.
thank you. I've learned a lot too here. You know, I'm teaching a first year experience, the HHP 131 class right now, and we're talking about how poor information literacy is, you know, from your data 10 years ago, you know, whatever.
Mhm.
Here's my point. You want to know how college students do research now? ChatGPT or TikTok or
Yeah.
right, or their YouTube influencer who is teaching them how working out is cool or whatever. You get what I'm saying?
Mhm.
So I see it as my obligation to address that in my intro class, right? How can I make those connections for them? Because it's not just how do you use the library, but that's a great opportunity
Right.
to connect, right?
No,
We
it's
talk about the
thinking
influence of
critically.
AI. It's not going away.
Yeah, it's thinking critically about information. And I think that should be across the curriculum. And I don't think that's the responsibility of the library alone. Yeah, I mean, the AI conflict is a whole new challenge that we have to face. And using AI tools like ChatGPT as a search engine is something that I don't know if we're talking about as much as we should be talking about. I think we've been overly focused on using those tools, you know, to write papers for us for plagiarism purposes. But the fact is, you can go on there and ask it a question, and sometimes it gives you better answers than Google does. So people are doing that. I've done it. Or the opposite, or the opposite. Yeah. It depends on the question, and it depends on the sources that it's pulling from. So, I mean, it's kind of the same problem, the way that we approach things when we talk about like what database to use or what resource to use with students. It depends on the question. Yeah.
Do you have any questions from any of the online viewers?
Tanya has a question.
I'm just curious, what kinds of collaborations are you envisioning for different classes? I see that some of it's like reestablishing connections. Perhaps other folks may have never had a connection. It's a new course or
Yeah.
something. Or are you looking to guest teach, co-teach? What does that look like?
I think it can vary depending on the class, depending on the faculty member, depending on the need. We like to keep it kind of wide open. So our traditional thing is we will come and do a talk about library resources, or have your class come to us and do a talk about library resources. But we can embed in the class, so if you can put us in the Canvas shell and we can interact with students. I think that's great for online classes, where we can actually see what the research projects that they're working on, and then we can maybe recommend resources for those students. That takes more work and more time, but it's always something that we're willing to do. We can also just create standalone learning objects, you know, video tutorials or research guides or things that you can embed in your class. Or we can consult with you. You know, one of the other things that I did over the summer was develop the information literacy workshop for faculty. And the whole idea behind that was to empower faculty to be teaching information literacy in their courses on their own, with or without the support of a librarian. So it can look like whatever you think fits best. And we're pretty open to whatever that collaboration might look like. Yeah.
Connected to that, you have done all this work, and I'm sure you have beautiful spreadsheets. But as you've already said, they're changing as we speak, or they should be changing as we speak, because everything changes here in curriculum. So keeping up with that huge project that you've started, that's not a possibility. So how do you see this evolving to becoming a working relationship where these things, where all this foundation that you've created can become a reality within our colleges and within our courses?
That's a great question, and I don't necessarily have a perfect answer for that. You know, it's one of the reasons why I signed up to do the first colloquium of the year, is because I wanted to start the conversation. Before coming here, I had a meeting with the deans where I asked for their buy-in and their support, and their ideas of how we might make this more systematic or create more opportunities to have these conversations. I think that people are interested. I think that people are just busy. And so when I was talking about how we're doing a lot of this by invitation, you know, we have to knock on a lot of doors. We have to put ourselves in the rooms where decisions are made. It doesn't just happen automatically, and it won't happen automatically as long as we don't have an information literacy outcome where everybody feels somewhat compelled to put that into their class. I think there's conversations that we could have in the gen ed overhaul if that's actually going to happen. You know, I think we as librarians need to be sometimes more intentional about the venues that we're in and what we're communicating, and try to get the word out a little bit better. But I think it's a really slow process. I think it's this, you know, and I've seen this unfold over the years. It's like you find a partner like Brenna who's willing to be an evangelist, and then as new faculty come in, she'll say, you gotta work with Sarah, and then they'll call me. Like, it's kind of a slow unfolding process. So I think to like start from the point of these spreadsheets that will be out of date by, you know, 2 months from now, at least we can have that conversation and say, I know your curriculum pretty well. I know this isn't perfect, but I've been looking at it, and I see these classes as potential opportunities for us to collaborate. Can we? And then we see where that goes. And I don't think we need to recreate the spreadsheets every single year, but if we can get meetings on the books every year, you know, if we can get invited to department meetings more regularly than we do now, then we have sort of that venue for having that conversation.
Thanks for your presentation. I want to try one of those. Can you say the name of the?
Maultaschen.
Maultaschen, thank you. I'm curious how you think about in the library sort of the division between information literacy and some of the other named outcomes like critical thinking or DPD. Do you feel like, or where does the point of connection happen? Because we can see how you could teach you could make strong connections, show how information literacy is interrelated with those other outcomes. Is that something, those connections that you feel you bring to programs and courses, or is it something that you're looking to connect with that specific course? I think I'm not quite articulating this question correctly, but do you feel like information literacy is sort of siloed rather than making connections to these other outcomes, when you could easily talk about information literacy from a critical thinking lens or from a DPD lens, that when we're looking at sources or looking at media, we're thinking critically, we're thinking about difference and discrimination. Is that happening, or how should that be encouraged?
I think of information literacy as critical thinking about information. So I see it sort of housed under that broader umbrella of critical thinking. I kind of agree that as soon as we make these things standalone outcomes, they do get kind of siloed in a way. So it's like, are you checking the information literacy box? Are you checking the UWR box? Are you checking the DPD box? And that merging or cross-influencing doesn't necessarily happen in the way that it would ideally. I do think that's kind of a risk of like just pinning down these really specific outcomes. But I think, you know, if I'm understanding your question right, I think it has a role in all of those things. I do think it has a role in critical thinking. I do think it has a role in DPD. I obviously think it has a role in UWR, the way that outcome is written right now, because it requires use of sources. But I think you can kind of expand your own information literacy as broad, especially within the disciplines, because I think it can look a little bit different in the disciplines, and I also think it looks a little bit different in the wild. You know, the information literacy we need to have to be good citizens, voters, those kinds of things, to be good consumers of the news. That looks a little different than being an information literate scientist. You know, the principles are the same, but how that actually plays out is different. I don't know if that really answers the question, but that's a complicated question.
How's it going? I want to talk about, I'm going to talk about the AI aspect as well. I thought bringing that up is good. We as faculty all have our own opinions about AI. I want to point out an article that we should all read. About 2 weeks ago, the journal Science had an article on looking at or using AI tools such as ChatGPT, but many other ones, and how it's much more effective at helping people no longer believe in conspiracy theories. And mainly, if you think about it, what it's doing is it's not based on the way it's searching is not based on the number of hits on that page or anything like that, right? And so do the library faculty, have you been thinking about how you might incorporate using AI tools as part of your teaching about information literacy?
Yes. I mean, I feel like this is a little bit of a trap because you know more than anybody what I do know and what I don't know about AI and how much time I have spent going to webinars about AI to build up my knowledge. You know, in a way, at this, like halfway through the year when this became a much more urgent conversation about AI, my reaction to that was kind of like, this isn't what I wanted my sabbatical to be. You know, I have these other ideas, these other things that I want to focus on. I don't want it to be all consumed by AI. And so I kind of avoided getting into it and learning about it until kind of late in the year, like April, May, June. And then I started getting into it and realizing I don't think we're having the right conversations about AI on this campus. Probably lots of campuses are not having the right conversations about AI. And we really do need to think about how that is parallel to information literacy instruction. So even just basic literacy about AI, like what is it do, how does it work, you know, what is a large language model, how that is also kind of a moving target as things are constantly being developed, and by the time we've all learned a thing about it, that's already passed by. Like when I first started getting into it, there was a big conversation about prompt engineering, and now prompt engineering is kind of going away. It's not necessary anymore. So I do think we need to be thinking about these tools and what are the actual practical uses of these tools for academics and for students. What are the ethical considerations? And I know people are talking about the ethical considerations quite a bit. I see that coming up a lot. Things like, you know, how much water and energy it uses to run a data center in order to be able to create these things. Like there's ethical uses beyond just a student's ethical or unethical use of the tool itself. So I think your question was ultimately, are the library faculty thinking about this? And the answer is yes, we're thinking about this. How that actually plays out and how we build that into our instruction, we have a lot of work to do, I think. We have a lot of learning to do and a lot of work to do in order to get there. Me in particular, because I feel like I'm a little bit late to the party. Can I add something? Yeah, please do.
I would just add that it's also hard because, you know, departments haven't adopted something, right? So if you go to each class is individual. So that makes it hard for us to go out there also because we don't know what each instructor feels or how they feel about it. So
yeah,
we're still trying to figure that part out as well, I think, too. Mm-hmm. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that. Like we had a conversation fairly recently about using tools like Elicit or Consensus, which are AI literature searching tools, to find sources for students when we've exhausted all other avenues. And I tested out those tools on my own project and got really great results. I basically got the same results in 2 seconds that it took me like a month combing through a whole bunch of databases to get. And we've tested it out with other topics where it was not as perfect, it was not as good, or it just was not subject specific enough to be appropriate. But there are some cases where maybe that's the sources that we find through those tools are good enough for the student. But if you have an AI policy that forbids students from using any type of AI tool, is that okay? So there's a little bit of hesitation, I think, on our part about introducing these tools with students, you know, and then getting in trouble because we're overstepping some departmental policy or course policy. yeah, it's really, really messy. And I would love it if we had more opportunities to all get together and talk about it. I know that there's, you know, a task force and a subcommittee and, you know, various groups talking about it, but that's not being shared with all of us. Like, I kind of just want Friday afternoon coffee hour where we talk about some AI tool or topic and we can share our experiences across disciplines. I think it shouldn't just happen in the library.
One more question, if there is one. Yeah, Jill.
So just to continue with that thread for one more minute, I'm just curious what they're saying in Germany about that technology as well, and what you learned from their perspective.
Yeah, so the most of the conversations that I had when I was in Germany about AI were in October. And so the conversation, I feel like, has already changed since then. At that time, and this was when I went to the European Information Literacy Conference, I heard people talking about things like, well, we just need to clean up the internet. So because it's drawing on the internet, if we clean up the internet and make sure all of the information on the internet is good, then the stuff that the AI tools are spitting out will be good, and that's where we should focus our efforts. So I felt like that is a very noble thought, but that can't happen. That won't ever happen. That's not possible, and I think it reflects a misunderstanding of how the internet works. So there's a lot of fear and a lot of paranoia. There's a lot more control and regulation, though, in the European Union than we have here. So I think, you know, they feel more comfortable maybe just outright banning certain tools and making them inaccessible to people. So there's conversations about that. Way more restrictive policies about AI use than we're seeing here. But they were still very much in the start of the conversation, and maybe not quite even as up to speed as what's happening here, because so many of these things are under development in the States, you know, so I think it's in the news a lot more. Yeah, good question.
I think if the labors of Hercules were rewritten as a modern myth, cleaning out the internet would be one of them. Well, thank you everybody for coming, and let us thank our speaker once again.
Thank you.